Hi, everyone. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome my good friend, Warren Neidich. I moved to New York City from Berlin in April of 1996. And I think it was in July that my roommate, Nina Cacciadorian, took me to an opening at a little gallery not too far from where we lived. We lived on Watt Street, sort of on the edge of Soho. It was Warren's gallery. It doesn't say this on your bio, but among Warren's many other incarnations, one of them was gallerist. Warren actually studied medicine early on. He was trained as an eye surgeon and practiced eye surgery. Also was trained in photography, art, and architecture. And like some of you, he morphed. He morphed from an oddball who operated on eyeballs to an artist, writer, and thinker. He makes speculative neon light sculptures. That's what he's made in recent years, but in the past, many other kinds of artworks. Amazing drawings, collages, other kinds of sculptures. And writes texts that occupy this kind of border terrain between art and neuroscience and the digital world and social justice, politics. So in addition to being a maker and a writer, he's also a reader and a thinker. And I guess the simplest way to sum it all up is creative intellectual. Warren's path and my path have crossed many times here and in London and elsewhere. And what all of our interactions have in common, I think, is that I always find myself challenged and confused a little because, honestly, he thinks about stuff and reads stuff that's hard for me to understand. Provoked, and through these sort of interactions and his general high level of energy and generosity, my world grows. I learn stuff. And I find that really exciting. So in recent years, Warren's work, his art and his writing, which are really sort of two sides of the same coin of practice, his work is focused on the human mind, on how cognition, thinking, and the human brain shape and are shaped by cultural practices, media, and also social formations. And most recently, his work is focused on developing critical perspectives on emerging forms of neural capitalism. If you Google neural capitalism, you'll see a bunch of stuff. Some of it will have Warren's name embedded in there, but it's a fairly new concept to describe something that is also fairly new. Some things that are fairly new, from the ways in which companies like Meta, through Facebook, use machine learning to curate our experiences and manipulate our desires in ways that shape our brains. And it's also fed by what our brains make. So there's this kind of complex feedback loop that is producing new economic forms. You could also think about psychopharmaceuticals and the ways in which they enable students, for example, to perform under the expectations of neoliberal economic institutions, or enable academic administrators to perform, or workers in general to be productive Anyway, this is something that Warren can explain much better than I can. Warren's artwork has been exhibited all over the place. Here's a selected list. Whitney Museum of American Art, MoMA P.S.1, White Columns, Artist Space, those are all in New York. The Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the List Visual Arts Center at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the LA County Museum of Art, the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, Germany, Haus Der Kunst in Munich, the ZKM, Zentrum für Kunst und Medien in Karlsruhe, Germany, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. Warren lived in Berlin for a while, also in London and Los Angeles, but glad to have him back in New York. ICA London and Palais Tokyo in Paris, France. His work has been written up, has been the subject of over 150 catalog essays and lots of museum and newspaper articles, including in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Artforum, Art in America, Kunstforum International, Hyperallergic, Time Out New York, and the New Yorker. Warren co-edited a 3-volume anthology called The Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, published by Archive Books. This is volume 3. I'll pass around also one of the catalogs so you guys can take a look while he's speaking. And he is taught at Brown University, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, Goldsmiths College in London, the Sorbonne in Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. We should say Oxford, I guess. And he's the founder and director of the Saas-Fee Summer Institute of Art, which I encourage you guys to check out, Saas-Fee. Please join me in giving a resounding warm welcome to Warren Neidich.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for showing up tonight. I have known Mark for quite a long time, and I've had some very interesting cafes with him all over the world. And here I am, thanks to him, and being invited to speak with you. It's my pleasure today to speak about a concept I developed called the brain without organs, and to bring that term, which I will explain to you, into a general idea about what I call an eco-cenic brain. And this is the core. Like, there's a few slides when I'm talking, which I'll say, look, you know, if you just remember this one, you know what I mean? There'll be like 5 slides. It's like, just remember and take this with you and it'll be fantastic, you know? So I want to, and what I do, because I talk a lot and teach a lot in Europe, where people don't speak English, is that I found this way of reading my PowerPoint is very, very helpful for people to understand what I'm talking about. So this is what I'm doing. I'm not reading a paper. I'm not giving a pure PowerPoint, although I will go off on a tangent occasionally. So this is the key to what I'm going to talk about. I want to hypothesize that the architecture of the brain of humankind, which I refer to as the collective intracranial, inside the skull, extracranial. The brain is also the social, political, economic, and historical relations, technological relations, art, complex, it's a continuum, is currently anthropocentrically complexified. Is that a word that you guys know, Anthropocene? Have you heard that like 1,000 times, right? So you know what that's all about. I'm going to define it again, but you've heard that. So our brains have been created by the Anthropocene. If it is this condition that I feel is at the root of the problem of climate change and its intersectional sisters, capitalism, racism, and sexism, I want to speculate upon another outcome. If only we have the courage to make it happen. I want to call for making an eco-cenic, sympoetic brain, a brain that is a product of deep ecological evolution created by technologies that embrace nature rather than simply consuming and destroying it. And this is what the whole lecture is about. I'm going to prove all of this and bring you through it. But let's first define Anthropocenic or anthropocentric, sympoetic, and deep ecology before elucidating the concept of a mutable brain, which is at the core of my speculation. The brain changes because of its neuroplasticity. Has everyone heard about neuroplasticity in their, on the radio and on, right? Neuroplasticity. Ayahuasca is something that creates a lot of, that stimulates the neuroplasticity, by the way. A lot of drugs do, serotonergic drugs. Thereafter, I would like to direct my comments to a recent exhibition that I've had called The Brain Without Organs. So what is the Anthropocene? The age of human and/or term Anthropocene was introduced by Paul Crutzen to emphasize the important role of humankind in the transformation of geology and ecology. According to him and his collaborator, Will Steffen, in their article, The Anthropocene, are humans now overwhelmingly the great forces of nature? The causes of this alteration are human-driven and consist of changes in, 1, the biological fabric of the earth, 2, the stocks and flows of major elements in the planetary machinery, such as nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, and silicon, and 3, the energy balance on the Earth's surface. Furthermore, according to them, the results of these interventions, these human interventions, will be a planet that is biologically less diverse, less forested, much warmer, and tempestuous. According to Donna Haraway, in discussing Anna Singh, who suggests that perhaps the outrage meriting a name like Anthropocene is about the destruction of places and times of refuge for people and other critters. Sympoesis refers to a system of relations used in threading networks. Think about, knitting, threading, or making a tapestry in ways that are not autopoetic. So autopoetic means that the system generates its own compounds that it lives on. A cell, the human cell, is an autopoetic system. And autopoiesis was this huge topic that everybody talked about in the 1970s because there was a book about autopoiesis. But sympoetic systems, according to Donna Haraway, are much more relevant to our times of science fiction, and it displaces autopoetic systems as models of life. And this is another word we're going to come back to. In the Chulocenic sympoetic systems, the Chulocene, I'll explain what that is, sympoetic systems abound and dominate the ways and means of interrelatedness. So this is all about interrelatedness. Sympoetic systems are collectively producing systems that don't have well-defined spatial and temporal boundaries. They're rhizomatic. Information and control are distributed among components. The systems are evolutionary and have the potential for surprising change. By contrast, autopoetic systems are self-producing autonomous units with self-defined spatial and temporal boundaries that tend to be centrally controlled, homeostatic, and predictable. I am proposing a theory of brain that is rhizomatic and sympoetic. As such, it is capable of change. I am understanding the other third term in my first introduction, deep ecology. I am understanding deep ecology in the way its founder, the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, did, as that philosophical movement which rejects the idea that humanity's relationship with nature is constructed by sense of only its usefulness for only human consumption, and instead understands that nature has its own inherent value. As such, human consciousness is not superior and disentangled from animal and plant consciousness, but rather intertwined. And this is really key because we're not just talking about the human brain, we're talking about human consciousness, but also animal consciousness, plant consciousness. So here's my piece, which I'm going to come back to at the very end, but I wanted to introduce it to you. This is a sculpture, a neon sculpture that I made called The Brain Without Organs, and it was in Los Angeles. But I will come back to it and I'll discuss this all. So here are the 5 things that I want to talk about. I want to introduce you to the word cognitive capitalism. That's one thing I want you to learn about, the early and the late stages. I want you to understand about this idea that I have called the expanded model of the brain that's just not intracranial. It's situated in a body that moves, but it's also extracranial. It's in a relationship, it co-evolves with social practices and technology and art and political systems and all these other kinds of things. It's a co-evolving entity. It's a continuum. I want to talk about neuroplasticity and a term that's a little complicated, but really not, which is exosomatic organogenesis, which is one of the great philosophers of technology, Bernard Stiegler, who's talk about my writing being difficult to read. His is almost impossible, but he's the one that came up with that term. And I'll kind of dumb down it and make it simple for all of us so we can understand what that is. And then from the body without organs to the brain without organs. And finally, hopefully all this different information that I'm telling you will be able to be used to understand what this premise of creating an eco-cenic brain is all about, a julocenic brain. How do we move from a brain that's been created for 2 million years by anthropocentric technologies that have destroyed the earth, like gunpowder, like fire, gunpowder, spear points, various kinds of armaments that help human beings survive at one point. But then after the confluence of Darwinism, capitalism, and the Anthropocene acted to actually destroy the planet. But we'll talk about that. So that's what we have in our heads right now and what that means, having an anthropocentric brain. We need to have an ecocentric brain, or an ecocenic brain, rather than an anthropocenic brain. We'll talk about that, okay? So what is cognitive capitalism? Here's some books that I wrote about this subject. I know a little bit about it. So the important thing about cognitive capitalism is it emerges around 1975. And in cognitive capitalism, the brain and the mind are the new factories of the 21st century, the brain and the mind. The proletariat, the worker the worker of industrial capitalism, working in the factory, making cars and objects and things like that, evolves into a cognitariat or mental labor. So the physical laborer, the proletariat, evolves into the cognitariat or the mental labor. Now, when I'm talking about all these things, of course, there are still secondary economies still exist, industrial economies still exist everywhere, but I'm kind of pushing this to a kind of position of the future, because all the money and all different kinds of investment is in all these new technologies, as we all know, Apple and all these other companies, Facebook, Instagram, all these kinds of things. It's where all the money is being, even though the other kinds of labor, agricultural labor, industrial labor, that's still around. So there still are proletariats, but I'm talking about, in this northern hemisphere, in Western Europe, and in Japan, and Asia, and Southeast Asia. Physical labor, especially in the northern hemisphere, is subsumed by mental labor. And this is called tertiary labor, to distinguish it from industrial and agricultural labor. It is divided by an early and late phase, and we're going to talk about that. So early cognitive capitalism, remember the brain and the mind are the new factors of the 21st century, right? Heralds a mutation of post-Fordism. You don't have to know what that is if you don't know. It is defined by precarious, part-time, insecure labor, a sleepless, multi-timed, 24/7 work schedule, and real subsumption where everything in life becomes work. The financialization of capital created by herd behavior in response to market forces, a shift to a valorization economy. And what does all that mean? And immaterial labor. What does that all mean? Well, we all know what that means. Precarious part-time labor. We're artists. We are precarious. We don't have insurance. We don't have any security net to catch us. We're struggling. But not only being artists, but in every industry now, people's insurance, medical insurance is being taken away. There are a lot of people out there who don't have medical insurance. Their life is precarious. 24/7 work schedule. Jonathan Crary has a book called 24/7. And it's about the fact that we're constantly working. We're working because we're cognitarians, we're mental laborers, we're creating data. That's our work now. We're data producers, right? That's what we do. And that data is not passive. It's not just being sold to policing agency, the government, and corporations to find out what we like and dislike, what we want to buy, where we're going to go, blah, blah, blah. It's actually becoming a device that is portending our futures. They're premonitions. They know we're going to do something before we even do it. And also in the future, because what cognitive activism is never something that happens in the present day, but real activism is knowing what's coming in the future and already creating an armamentarium of devices and things to prevent and to kind of lessen the blow of these new kinds of political despotism that are already in existence in some parts of the world. Yeah, right? Black Mirror, all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. So I don't have time, but if I have time at the end, I'll give you my really example of cognitive activism and the neural capitalism that will really make you see what it's all about. Here's the difference. In Fortis factories, the laborer, here we have laborers on an assembly line, assembling a car, or in this case, we have somebody hitting a hammer against a surface. In Fortis factory, the laborer was under the jurisdiction and tyranny of the assembly line, in which styles of management and their behavior was regulated by specific scientific studies instituted by what's called Taylorism, in the production of an optimized synchronization of the human working body to the machine, increasing the worker's surplus value. And what is surplus value? It's the excessive value produced by the laborer, his products, above the amount of his or her wages. So this is what it's all about, surplus value. How do you optimize the physical body to interact with the assembly line in such a way that there's less friction, that more work can be done, more product can be made within a certain time period. But today, how different is mental labor? Here, we're all cognitarians, right? Working on a variety of devices, reconceptualizing the notion of working together, right? Taylorism has been replaced by a term called Hebbianism. You don't have to know that, in which methods, but you do, it is interesting, for optimizing mental labor. So we're not the capitalism today is not interested, or still is, of course, in some places, interested in optimizing physical labor, but it's now more interested in optimizing mental labor because we are operating on virtual platforms. And we're engaged 24/7, work schedules in which weekends, we don't have weekends anymore. We're working in multiple time zones, and we're not getting any sleep. Anybody have any questions so far? I know we're supposed to have questions at the end, but is everything cool so far? Are you very cool? Is it cool? Yeah? Yes.
Just recognizing that using the term capitalism is acknowledging the intellectual lineage of artists. And I'm wondering why we're thinking of it as cognitive capitalism per se versus, say, cognitive economics or cognitive extractivism. Is it important to think of in terms of specifically Marxist terminology like surplus value, which contemporary economists, even ones that are right-wing, don't really.
Well, the reason I think you're right. Of course, it could be called all those different things. The reason I'm calling it cognitive capitalism is because of a kind of history of a specific philosophy that emerged out of northern Italy called cognitive capitalism, which started around 1975, and that it became very important in the 1980s, which was about this change that labor became immaterial, that labor was performative, that labor wasn't so much about producing objects and things anymore, but it was about performances and virtuoso performances, and that didn't leave a trace necessarily. And that was called cognitive capitalism. That was the term that was used. And it was very much rooted in Marxism and all these other kinds of things. It was definitely doing that. However, that is why I continue to use that term. And they were the first people, the first kinds of philosophers to really understand the relationship of cybernetics and communication theory.
So when we see in mainstream publications like the New York Times or the New Yorker, or in terms of knowledge worker or information economy or experience economy, Are those, although they're cut off from the Marxist lineage, are those talking about similar things?
Oh, and we call them, I'm calling them mental laborers or cognitarians. Of course, cognitarian comes from the books of Franco Berardi. And he developed this idea of the cognitarian, the mental labor. We're not doing physical labor, at least at this point. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? But who knows? We might be working with holograms soon. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Things might project out of the computer rather than constantly being engaged with the computer. So you're absolutely correct. I'm using cognitive capitalism as a historical reference, which has a lot of connections to a certain kind of theoretical framework. However, we are talking about the information and knowledge economies. Cognitive capitalism is about that. And we're talking about cognitive labor. Yeah. So in late stage cognitive capitalism, or the neural turn in cognitive capitalism, commences around the turn of the century, the so-called century of the brain. In a world, which is in a world which is trending towards predominant forms of labor, which are performative, intellectual, and service-oriented, the machinery of the brain takes on added importance as a locus of neoliberal exploitation and speculation. The privatization of the neural common, or its neural variation and plasticity by neural capitalism. If it consists of 5 conditions, we're not going to speak about all of them, but I'd like to just talk more about neuropower. Yeah.
Just regarding the plasticity,
Sure.
Being something that is like your brain building bridges to make a habit out of something you need to do. So is cognitive capitalism also implying self-perpetuation by design, like guaranteeing its own self-perpetuation?
Well, that's a fabulous question. Because I do think there is a drive for variation, and that drive for variation is as powerful a drive as any other sex drive. It's as powerful as sex drive, and it has to do with the evolution of our species. Is the fact that we human beings are constantly creating and changing our Umwelts, our sensory and motor in niches. We're constantly changing, we're constantly inventing to stimulate this neuroplasticity, to constantly create it, make it evolve into new kinds of combinations of things. It's also, so there's forms of emancipation that neuroplasticity is, I think this is what you're saying, is a place of emancipation, but it's also a possibility for despotism, because whereas, 50, 60 years ago, when you went to religious school as a 4 or 5 year old, or a 3 or 4 or 5 year old, they didn't know what they were actually doing was sculpting the neuroplasticity, the most powerful moments, this kind of, and I'm going to show you this in a minute. They didn't have it. It was indirect. They didn't know. It was part of, what they did, and they saw it had results, long-term results. Little did they know, as they do now, that it's the neuroplasticity, and now they are purposely manipulating those conditions. Yeah. That was great. Thank you so much for that question. And that's what neuropower is, basically, what I just said. So I don't have to talk about that. But here we have what also is interesting about neuropower and this later stage of cognitive capitalism and its engagement with the neuroplasticity and is its relationship to memory. And this is a work by Aby Warburg called the Builder Atlas Mezzanine in the 1920s. The historian art and culture theorist Aby Warburg created his Builder Atlas Mnemosyne, tracing recurring visual themes and patterns across time, from antiquity to the Renaissance and beyond to contemporary culture. His approach provides inspiration for today's visually and digitally dominated world. In cognitive capitalism, the archive, and this is really important, is deterritorialized from its locations in museums, libraries, digital platforms, to the space and time of the mind's eye. That space, when you close your eyes and you imagine something and you can see it, you can all close your eyes right now and you can imagine your bedrooms at home, maybe your dog or your cat or your iguana there in the room running around, and you see your bed, or there might be a painting on the wall. We can all see that. That's your mind's eye. Yeah, that is the place where power is asserting itself now. And that is the new archive. That's called the mind's eye and working memory. Those places inside our head wherein we imagine and construct interior narratologies that are reflected upon by our understanding and create our general consciousness. As the name implies, working memory has to do with how we hold information in the mind and work on it. Thus, it is related to performing the cognitive labor of our conscious imagination. Instead of documents, objects, things that gather together signs and meanings to be inspected and scrutinized in order to understand transformational processes, long and short-term memories are its currency. Power is now focused upon the contents and operations of this working memory and cognitive capital in its desire to regulate thought and destroy difference. Attention and salience, or internal attention, is important in this process. Okay, so what is this brain model that we've been talking about, this expanded brain model, the situated intracranial, extracranial complex? So here's a kind of drawing that I made to kind of describe this. And you see that, as I mentioned to you, the brain isn't just inside the head here. It's not just in the skull, but there is a material brain inside the skull. And it's a place of tremendous variation in plasticity. But the brain is also the microsome, the transplantable microsome. It's situated. It's the flesh of the body. It's the autonomic and autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's also this world. It has to do with the social, political, and economic relations of our world today. Immaterial labor, accelerations, technology, performativity, fake news, post-humanism, big data, social media, post-advocacy, post-humanist, post-operatism. These are also part of the brain, and they recycle back. It's a co-evolving system. What is produced by the brain changes this extracranial brain, and then that change then molds and reshapes the neuroplasticity. And what happens if you think of the architecture, because I studied architecture, if you think of architecture, you think of what's called the skin of architecture. You look at the history of architecture. There's a kind of engagement, a generational engagement with architecture, in which each generation, if you think of, for instance, the Louvre and the IMP, the Louvre Palace, and the IMP structure in the middle of it, it shows you two very, very different ideas of architecture that leave very, very different kinds of sensorial distributions, which then are going to sculpt the brain in very, very different ways, not only visually, but also through movement and through action and the kinds of sociological relations that occur inside those spaces, the kind of political dimension they have, the kind of relationship to, on one hand, monarchy, on the other, a kind of neoliberalism. You know what I mean? These different spaces are kind of relevant. That's cultural memory. And that's what's left. That's skin of architecture. The outside, if you just think about the buildings on the outside, those are kind of what's called the skin of architecture. And that skin of architecture is layered. It's like the layers of a palimpsest or the layers of an onion, one layer on top of another. And sometimes the layers below change, or sometimes the layer as it gets manifested on the other underlying layer change. But the fact of the matter is that this outer layer and the human beings that happen to pass by in that particular generation or that epoch, that is what is sculpting the neuroplasticity of the brain. And that goes on forever, on infinitum. And here's a Tony Osler remote control, 2009. I thought that was a kind of interesting representation of that idea. the intracranial and the extracranial brain, and this role of technology and drugs, by the way, because that could be an alcohol bottle or water, but I think it's likely. So later, when we speak of the brain without organs, which is what I'm going to try to get to, I hope in the amount of time, as a product of neuroplastic sculpting, right? It's being sculpted. The neuroplasticity is like a piece of clay. We will understand that all forms of brains, intra, extra situated, also constitute the brain without organs. So the brain without organs, this thing that I'm going to talk to you about, is just not the intracranial brain, it's the extracranial brain as well. It's happening to that whole system. It's rhizomatic and thus a condition operating on multiple platforms simultaneously, as each is synchronously deregulated, deterritorialized, defamiliarized, internally and externally, in relation to a constituted, radicalized, post-humanistic subjectivity. Importantly, today, as we move into late-stage cognitive capitalism, we must embrace the ecosophical and deep ecological conceptual framework of the brain. It is no longer just the socio-political, cultural, technological relations that sculpt the neuroplasticity of the brain, but the socio-political, cultural, technological relations in the context of an expanded universe of ecological relations. That's what a rhizome looks like. And there's the difference between a rhizome and what's called an arboreal metaphor. So the arboreal metaphor was the metaphor that we all used until Gilles Deleuze came around, I guess, which was like a genetic tree. You know, you can look at your family tree, it's a genetic tree. That's why they call it a genetic tree, right? And here we have the rhizome where everything is interconnected. And that's what the brain is. The brain is interconnected, not only inside itself, but, you know, it's multi-species, right? It's not just human. It's connected to all of the other critters of the earth. And that's what we have to understand. That's what we have to embrace in deep ecology. Now, of course, those of you who have done psychedelic drugs, I being one, I grew up in high school. I did most of mine in high school. I didn't really do any as I got older, but I did a lot in high school. We know about what I'm talking about, because all I can tell you is my experience with psychedelic drugs was that I was embedded in nature. I was no longer this human being on top of the hierarchy, no longer separated, but I was a human being. A human consciousness was interdigitated with nature and animals and plants, right? I mean, anybody in here know what I'm talking about? Okay, right, okay. I'm not telling anybody. Okay, so now we're in neuroplasticity and exosomatic organogenesis. Woo! Right on. Well, here's a neuron. Everybody knows, I hope knows what this is, but you know, it's got a soma, which is the cell body with these appendages, which are called dendrites going off of it. It's got a nucleus where all the machinery, the DNA and all the protein machinery starts, and then it gets made in the soma with all the ribosomes and through messenger RNA and all of that. And then these compounds travel down the axon and end up at these this is a motor nerve endings. Okay, whatever. And then here's an action potential, which is how one neuron communicates with another through an electric potential that has to do with ion changing differences, which you don't have to know, but you just have to know that there's something that they communicate to each other. And then when they communicate to each other, that stimulus, that electric pulse, that action potential releases chemicals into a chemical synapse. Do you see this area here? This is called the chemical synapse. This is the presynaptic membrane, and this is the postsynaptic membrane. And these are called serials, transmitters. That's what serotonin, epinephrine, adrenocortisone, all these different kinds of neurochemicals are stored. And then when the electric impulse comes roaring down, they merge with the presynaptic membrane, and they release their contents into this synaptic space, which is very, very small, and they open up gates. And these are kind of gates, like the white picket fence with the gate that you enter, it's part of American folklore. Well, this is the white picket fence, and these are different ways of getting in. And then when that transmitter moves through the gate, it causes another reaction, and that's what happens. And this is where the neuroplasticity is occurring. The neuroplasticity is occurring at that synaptic junction. That's why I brought that up. So this is called the synaptic junction. And this is whenever you hear about neuroplasticity, a lot of it is happening there, okay? Okay, I don't want to get too much into physiology, but anyway, but I think Catherine Malibu is a very important figure in all of this discussion. So I thought I would bring up something that she said, okay? And she was arguing that brain plasticity operates on 3 levels. The modeling of the neural connections, which she calls developmental plasticity, the modification of the neuronal connections, 2, and the capacity for repair. And here's an example of how memory and learning take place. And it's all at the synaptic junction. So what happens is, in number A, what happens is the normal stimulus comes down and it causes a certain reaction. So on the left, on the bottom here, on my graph, that's the stimulus, and that's the reaction of the neuron. And you see it has like a little hum. Everyone see that? Okay, in time, it has a voltage, is V, and has a little hum. Then what happens is a tightness of a series of repetitive boom, 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 stimulations come down. This tree, you can see it's very arboreal-like. It's more, very dendritic. It's very rhizomatic. It's very anarchic, and it causes the voltage to go boom, 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 boom. But then what happens? This is the key to learning. As a result of this tightness, as a result of this hyperstimulation, there occurs when you give that same complex of neuron, that neural tree, the same stimulus. Instead of getting this small little hump, you get a much larger hump. So something has been learned, something has happened. And where that has happened is this is all going to be important, believe me. I know it's all happened at the synapse. And here we have 2 conditions, one before the tetanus and the other after the tetanus. And you notice that learning is something changes in the synapse. The number of spherules increases, the amount of chemical that's released increases, and the number of gates now open are also increased, and also the reactions. What kinds of gates? This is where, believe it or not, all of psychedelic drugs occur. They occur here. They cause changes there. And why is this important? Well, it turns out that if you look at a newborn, they have 5 trillion of these synapses. And by the time they have 50 trillion, and a 1-year-old has 1,000 trillion, but the adolescent only has 500 trillion. There's been something happening. There's been pruning. There's been removal. There's been sculpting. This is what I mean by sculpting, yeah? And here we have a perfect example. This is a slide that would be great if you remembered it. Has nothing to do with art in a way, but it has to do with the power of art. This is where the power of art is, okay? This is where it's at, okay? On your left, you have a 17-day-old kitten, and on the right, you have an adult kitten. And you notice that when the kitten, at 17 days old, something magical happens. Because of, in the DNA, it causes a very, very exuberant growth of all different kinds of synapses. And it doesn't matter, it's not really specific. It's just everything that's there, it's production. But each one of those things, believe it or not, it looks very anarchic and entropic. Each one of those synapses has a specific quality to it. It has a specific knowledge. It takes with it a certain kind of knowledge. It's looking for something in the environment to stimulate it. And as this is the cat, I'm showing the cat's umbel, its perceptual motor niche. And you see that different kinds of behavior, social behavior, this is hunting behavior, capturing rabbit behavior, aggressive behavior, all these different kinds of behaviors are these visual, all these different kinds of visual stimulation. By the way, this is the visual cortex. I should have mentioned that. This is the visual cortex we're all facing. So the cat's environment, the cat's experience causes as I said, with the infant, a reduction and a sculpting of these branches into a finely tuned machine that is specific for the experiences of a cat. Yeah, you get that? That's pretty. Anybody have a question about this slide? No? Okay. Okay. And I'm not going to get involved because it's a, and Bruce Wexler states, Bruce Wexler is another person very important in this field, states that human beings are the only organisms that can consciously and unconsciously alter its habitat. See, because if you, cats and elephants and giraffes, they have umwelts. They basically are born with a certain, what's called a phenotype, and they have an extended phenotype. In other words, a giraffe can reach certain kinds of leaves. Its body is not only something that is genetically construed, but it's construed into the ecological niche that it will inhabit. So think of an elephant also. The trunk can reach certain kinds of trees. It can eat certain kinds of things. It can drink water in a certain way. It's it has this whole thing that it does that it already is set into motion as soon as it's born. Human beings are different. We have umwelts that are constantly and radically being changed because we're creative and we're creating. The umwelts are not stable, and that's what he means here. First, there is an explosive genetically activated phase occurring in the womb in which billions of neural elements are scheduled to multiply together at a moment called the critical period. That's what we saw on the 17-day-old cat. That was the critical period. Subsequently, these are pared down and sculpted by the outside world, created an internalized homologue or neural bios. So it's when that is sculpting, that sculpture that we saw is a homologue. It's like a mirror of what was important for that animal to pay attention to and have visually attentive to. Those elements that are most intensely and repeatedly stimulated by repeated interactions in the socio-political environment are preferentially selected for. I'm not going to get into that. And here we are, right? Here we are. The human umwelt is the screen and the connection to the cloud, which is the new sovereign in cognitive capitalism and forms the political brain of the neural bios. Yeah? Imagine that you begin using the web at age 4. Dedicated software agents track and adapt to your emerging interests and random explorations. They then help direct your attention to new ideas, web pages, and products. Over the next 70 years, you and your software agents are locked in a complex dance of co-evolutionary change and learning, each being influenced by the other. In such a case, in a very real sense, the software entities look less part of your problem-solving environment than part of you. The intelligence system that now confronts the wider world is biologically you plus software agent. And that same kind of pruning and is happening in artificial neural networks as well. So here we have before pruning, and then after, and then this artificial neural network, and we'll see this in a minute, is looking for patterns in the outside world, and those patterns they impinge themselves on the inner layer of the artificial neural network, and those patterns then cause certain kinds of reactions in the inner layers called of the synapses. They're called synaptic weights. They create synaptic weights, and you can see the same kind of pruning that we talked about in the cat and we talked about in real neural networks is happening here. And then here is on the left, what's called one of the earliest kinds of artificial neural networks. This is actually in the 1960s. It says 1980s, but anyway, which was called the perceptron, which was based on the retina, which was based on the anatomy of the retina, and it had three layers. And then we have the deep learning neural networks that are part of convoluted neural networks that are based on the cerebral cortex, especially the visual cortex, and what's called the inferior pathway to the temporal lobe. And basically, neuroscientists and computer scientists have been mirroring each other's investigations and have come up with models that are based on real models in the brain. And then, of course, this is quite interesting. This is the world map of 24-hour relative average utilization of the internet. And we have this pattern. And then we also have the way that neuroscientists are now talking about the brain. And they're talking about it as networks and with node centrality and node strength and core membership, which is basically a model that mirrors how the internet is working and how people are preferentially going to certain internet sites over others. And there's a distribution of interactiveness with the internet, which is similar to the models that, it's all about that nothing is separated. And then we have this word that we've been talking about that you'll see now makes a lot of sense, which is epiphylogenesis is intimately related to the evolution of the brain, its expansion and enlargement, as well as its increased capacities. Epiphylogenesis is the process through the phylogeny of technical species. So the technology, if you think of technology as something that evolves, if you think about the first fire, the first Olduvai spear points, the way that those technologies of the spear, evolved. Then we had the bow and arrow, and then we had gunpowder, and then we had the rifle. So there's an evolution of these technological processes. That's what it's talking about. These are, each one of them is a technical species, and the phylogeny is what it looks like. The phylogeny is what it looks like. So the phylogeny of the technical species, or the evolution of technical apparatus in time. And in time, this phylogeny, this process is transmissible. And that's what organogenesis is. Through a process, I don't want to get into that because it's too complicated. It doesn't make sense, really. The history of the human is therefore no longer a realm of genetic evolution, but of technical evolution. And that according to Stigler, this technical evolution is what's changing the brain. And he distinguishes this technical evolution from biological evolution by calling it epiphylogenesis. He later called that exosomatic organogenesis. So in other words, technical species and the evolution of technical species is a more rapid way to change the biological brain than genes are, in fact. That they cause changes in a much more rapid way. Steiger introduces the link between material culture of tool evolution to that of material evolution of the brain's gray matter, when speaking about evolution in Xanthropian to the Neanderthal. We submit that between these two ruptures, cortex and equipment, cortex and technology, are differentiated together in one and the same movement. The issue is that a singular process of structural coupling in which exteriorization that we are calling an instrumental meiutics. Meiutics mean mirroring, a mirror protostage, in the course of which the differentiation of the brain's cortex is determined by the tool, just as much of the tool by the cortex. And what is art? What is architecture? They're tools. So this is not just happening. And part of the tool, when you read Stigler, some of the things that he's talking about are the beads that they bury human beings with, during burial services. These are not just technologies. They're technologies that evolved during certain kinds of religious ceremonies in which ayahuasca or other drugs were taken, and visions and mystical visions were seen and then readapted to certain kinds of tools that took place during those artifacts, tools, religious artifacts that took place during those ceremonies. So so we're not just talking about these tools in a way, like the humble farmer, like, tools used for agriculture, or knives for making spears. We're talking about art. Art is changing the brain. Art is also changed. It's also an evolutionary process. It's also a phylogenetic process. If you think we know this when we think of, like, for instance, let's talk about the difference between like impressionism and conceptual art. For instance, how different those two things look. Do they cause changes in the brain that are different? Who knows? If we look at the architecture of situationism versus the architecture of Corbusier, La Radieuse versus the Derive. Does everyone know what situationism is? So Situation is an amazing and important art historical movement that took place in France in the 1950s. And it was run by, it was kind of a little bit related to surrealism, but it was something brand new. It kind of combined surrealism and Dadaism, but the whole Situationism, and it was run by this guy named Edebor. And they came up with very, very new ways of understanding the city. So one of the things they developed a number of different apparatuses. For instance, one was called the derive, yeah? One was called psychogeography. And there was another one where you superimposed maps upon each other. So these were this really way of differently understanding the city. So a derive was, you'd be walking down the street, and instead of following the street, you would go take a derive. You would take a different path. You would go across an empty lot. You would go see something. You would go, according to friends of mine who knew him, knew more about him. My friend Matthew Copeland told me that what they did really was that they would follow a path of which bars they were going to go to. So that was really part of the derive. They would follow different bars that they were going to, rather than in the Villa Arson, which was this famous Corbusier, a famous city structure. There was this very, very much like New York City, right-angled streets that you would follow, and it was very organized, and everything was very, very organized. Those two different conceptual frameworks of the city, one that was very organized and had streets that were right angles to each other, versus another city which was more about a kind of derive, or a kind of alternate pathway and discovering for yourself a city. It's a very different kind of experience, and those different kind of experiences relate to different forms of culture. And so here we have this change in the frontal cortex, and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This straight line becomes more and more at an acute angle, and that's because the frontal cortex is enlarging. But it's not just the frontal cortex. You can also see, if you look carefully, that the sides of the cortex of the brain are also getting larger as the parietal lobe increases. And then if you look a little bit towards the jaw, that area is also increasing, because that's where the language areas are. So what's going on is that the brain of human beings is changing. And according to Stiegler, it's because of these different kinds of technologies. So what Stiegler failed to fully recognize, and what I feel I can offer, is that the 2 million history that elapsed from Homo habilis to Homo erectus and onward to Homo sapiens is populated by a history of neuro-machinic entanglements, which are defined first by violence towards nature and the humans themselves, as in war, in an effort to survive and conquer. The invention of fire and the spear points, and later the conspicuous consumption resulting from the simultaneous occurrence of capitalism and neoliberalism in the 19th century, set the stage for destruction of the biosphere and nature that are the hallmarks of what Paul Crutzen and Will Steffen have called the Anthropocene. And those instruments, those technologies that are responsible for the devastating alterations of the Earth's climate, surface composition, and species and plant diversity are also the same instruments that helped shape the human brain. And this process is still going on. And so here are some of those instruments these lead kind of the fire or the spear and all these other kinds are leading in the end to kind of an anthropocentric brain, which here is bombing in Ukraine. Is not simply a human catastrophe, but an environmental one as well. Okay, so here we go. From the body without organs to the brain without organs. So a body without organs is a real term, by the way. It's something that's been around, and it's for the French dramatist Antonin Artaud. The body without organs was understood as the body is the body. It stands alone. It has no need of organs. The body is never an organism. Organisms are the enemies of the body. So for Artaud, for instance, having a sex change or taking hormones that change your body, this is what a body without organs is. Piercing is another, piercing bodies together in communal relations. This is kind of the idea, or being a muscle working out and having large muscles. This is a body without organs. It's an organism that doesn't have to be maintained by a certain kind of organization of the DNA. So the concept of the body without organs was expanded upon in the writings of Gilles Deleuze, especially The Logic of Sense, and is further refined in his collaboration with Felix Guattari in Anti-Oedipus and the Thousand Plateaus. So what is a body without organs? For Deleuze and Guattari, the body without organs is made up of plateaus or continuous planes of consistency without borders. It is through communication with the other plateaus on the other planes of consistency that the body without organs becomes transformed. Now, has anybody read Deleuze in this class? Okay, this is now a lot of this is like something that I believe in. Now, the thing is that theory and philosophy has gotten some bad press. But that's because of a certain relationship to philosophy and theory. Artists create theory. Art comes before philosophy, not after it. The problem with the way that theory and philosophy was taught in the 80s and the 90s, and that made everybody kind of against it, was that it became another kind of despotism. That that you would all of a sudden use art to translate a certain text. That art no longer had the freedom to be whatever it was, but now had to follow the dictions of the text that was written. And conceptual art, and Joseph Kosuth is a lot to blame for this. Now, Mark said that I'm a curator. Well, it turns out, yeah, you did. You said I was a curator. Oh, hey, Geller. Well, I am curating a show. All would love you to come to, called Wet Conceptualism versus Dry Conceptualism. And it's going to be at the end of November at 42 Walker Street in Tribeca. Okay, that's where I'm doing it. It's called the gallery is called the Opening Gallery. And I'm having it's going to be a cool show. And part of this is that art comes before theory. Theory has to follow art. Art estranges, and when I talk about art, architecture, poetry, filmmaking, everything. It's not writing scores. I'm not talking about art, fine art. I'm also talking about art that's really ugly and fucked up. For me, that's art. I'm not talking about these kind of weird essences of beauty and all this crap. I'm not into that at all. I'm into the most experimental thing that any artist could possibly do. That has to do with the specific social, political, economic, and cultural relations that they are living in. Your generation, your epoch. What stimulates and turns you on? But the fact of the matter is that when you create a work of art, philosophy has to catch up to you. This is what I'm talking about. When I say we should, on the other hand, there's a way that I would call what I do, what I've been giving you a lecture today, and what Deleuze does, and I'm not putting myself on Deleuze's level, I'm just saying what we do. So, is that my philosophy, my theory, is a work of art. I'm looking at it that way. Whether you want to call it science fiction, which I could call it also that, but the fact of the matter is that I'm looking at it as an artwork. Just everything that I'm doing it's a kind of artwork, yeah. And I'm looking at. I think that what happens is that somebody like Deleuze is an artist, and I find that understanding and reading this will be a fabulous experience for you all. So please read 1,000 Plateaus. You'll be amazed at how easy it is to read and how much you already know. But anyway, art before philosophy. Let them catch up to you. Okay, so but anyway, it's a body in which the organization of the organs are free from the despotism of the body's overall plan. In other words, it's free of the rules and regulations of the specific a priori program studied in the DNA code. A brain, I'm getting to the end of this, guys. You guys have been great. Just hang in there a little bit longer. We have so far surveyed the notion of the body without organs. Is the notion of the body without organs up to the task of emancipating a body which is disembodied in cognitive capitalism? So if the cognitive capitalism is a mental labor, no longer a physical labor, the body without organs was a way disrupting that optimization that I was telling you about between the worker, the physical labor on the assembly lines relationship to what they were doing. It was a disruption. That was what the body without organs was. It disrupted the body, so it no longer could fit so well into a program that had been defined by a normalized body. So in cognitive capitalism, transformation of labor requires a contemporary form of dissentence and estrangement. And that's what the brain without organs is such a form of resistance. So I want to go a little bit into this. Again, it's an entity that is indeterminate and malleable, and the brain without organs is in a constant state of becoming. We see that in neuroplasticity. It's in a constant state of becoming and regression towards a concept of indeterminacy. And so now we want to go into deep ecology in the brain without organs. The process of exosomatic organogenesis is an ongoing process. So there are constantly new technologies being created, and those technologies are changing the brain continuously. It's happening today. The internet natives and internet immigrants. I'm an internet immigrant. You're an internet native. I'm arguing that your brains are different than mine. Okay? The technology has changed our brains. We have different psychopathologies. Attention deficit disorder was not something that was available to all. It was not something that was so common as it is today. Okay, it could be a manifestation of a future brain. The different kinds of changes that are occurring in the immigrant, the internet native, could really be something that in the future, because of that neural diversity and that embracing the neural diversity of the person with ADD and ADHD. Embracing them, they could be the future brain in a world full of screens. We don't know. The older brain, my brain, may not be able to function in that environment. So we don't know. And the brain without order, I want to suggest that we have the possibility to produce an eco-cenic or chulocenic brain. So if we develop technologies that are in line with nature, that doesn't want to consume it and destroy it, but wants to live in harmony, or wants to think about it outside the box, in the sense that maybe it's symbiotic or sympoetic. It's something that both of us can gain something from. Is modeled, but not by an anthropocentric technology, is at odds with nature, but ecocentric, that respects nature and wants to live in harmony. So the Chulocene, because I use that word chulocenic here, brain. So what is I always, after I mention a word, I always kind of come back and define it. So it's to renew the biodiverse powers of the terra, is a sympoetic work at play in the Chulocene. This is a word of Donna Haraway, also somebody you should read. Specifically, unlike either the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, the Chulocene is made up of ongoing multi-species stories and practices of becoming in times that remain at stake in precarious times, in which the world is not finished, the sky has not fallen. So we still have time. We are at stake to each other. Unlike the dominant dramas of Anthropocene and the Capitalocene discourse, human beings are not the only important actors in the Chulocene. So the Chulocene and the Ecocene are the same. Just she uses the word Chulocene, I'm using the word Ecocene. It's not only important actors in the Chulocene, with all other beings able to simply to react. The order is reknitted. Human beings are with and of the earth, and biotic and abiotic powers of this art are the main story. So this is the piece that's called the Brain Without Organs. And it started out with these black light paintings that I did. And so when you walked into the space, there was this black light room that I set up. And then there was the main gallery, which I'll show you in a minute. But what I want to show you is that this is the brain, the normalized brain. This is not the brain without organs. This is the brain that we all know. This is the outside of the brain. And each one of those red lines is called a sulci. When you look at the outside of the brain, you see these depressions. So that's a mapping. And in the history of neuroscience and in the history of neurology, those sulci act as borders, as ways of mapping the brain, and in a very old-fashioned way, thinking of the brain as various modules rather than the way we think today as a network brain. But anyway, these are black light paintings made with red black light paint, and it's just of the sulcite. Then I took all those sulcite and I took a picture of my drawings and I put them into Photoshop and I exported all of the sulcite and I made a vocabulary of all the sulcite of the brain. Yeah. Then I use various random processes, very much like fluxes, the roll of the dice, cutting them all up and putting them in a hat and picking them out. And then I constructed these brain without organ paintings. So these became the studies for the larger sculpture. And these are the various combinations of these sulcite that using techniques coming out of fluxus, right? Everyone knows what fluxus is? Okay. And I think many of you students in this room would love to know more about fluxus. Okay. I mean, it was, again, situationism is also very important. But fluxus is something that is really about, it spanned not just the visual arts, but the musical arts, dance, and theater. So when you've heard of John Cage, right? Who's heard of John Cage? Right? John Cage was a fluxus artist. He's one of the most important flux artists. His idea of I Ching and rolling the dice, his ideas of 4 minutes and 37 seconds where you come into a room and David Tudor goes on the piano and he opens up whatever covers the keys. What is that called? That thing you open up? Yeah, the lid over the keys. But there's a name for that. There's actually a name for that. Yeah. The lid on the piano. Anyway, he lifts that up and he sits there for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's a famous piece, right? That's out of fluxus, right? There was Namjoon Paik, Charlotte Moorman, all these people were fluxus artists. And it was all concerning chance and uncertainty and what's called contingency. And the leader of this group was George Mussenius, and he used to have these huge events. Anyway, wonderful thing to learn about fluxus. And there's a residency in Venice, Italy. The Eleanor Hartnett Foundation is one here in New York, but they have a residency which is dedicated to fluxus art. So learn about it and apply and go to Venice for free for a month. Anyway, so I'm using those techniques. I'm mining the history of art. I'm cutting up that piece of poster that I made and putting them into a hat and then pulling them out of the hat or throwing dice or whatever. And I'm coming up with these different paintings, which are black light. They look great. I use black light because it's related to neon. For me, it was related to neon. It was a process. The feeling of a black light painting is, to me, mimics neon. So I was interested in that. So here's a close-up of one of those. Okay. And what was interesting about this next painting was that I made this next painting by all the experiments that I was doing. So when I was mixing, I had a canvas. It's on a black. First, I painted a canvas black, right? All the same, a flat black gesso, and then I have it next to me, and I'm basically mixing the paints on this board, on this canvas, and I'm also trying out how to glue things on here with medium, how to use different kinds of medium, and I'm using, it's experimental. And that becomes a painting that's in the exhibition. It came about just by accident. So that was an important part of the exhibition in that room. So then now what happens is that I should have brought a movie. I realized I have a movie of this because this is really happening. It's really moving. This is just one moment in the sculpture, but the whole sculpture is vibrating. But I should have done that. Sorry about that. But anyway, there's a stainless steel semicircular container, which is built according to a Fibonacci spiral, which is a geometric form. And inside this mirrored surface is the sculpture that's sitting there. And then, as you can see on the stainless steel, I have these words that are from the Eco-cenic. So this was the first attempt to try to create not only a sculpture that was a neon sculpture, which was a brain without organs, which was it wasn't a structure that was, it is a brain, but it's a brain that is sculpted in a completely different way than the normalized brain, and to create a kind of neural diverse entity. I also put on these on the surfaces of the stainless steel words that have to do with the Eco-cenic, like recuperation and composting and Gaia. And Gaia is a word originally proposed by James Lovelock, recently made famous by Bruno Latour in his famous book Gaia. In its original context, it means a fragile, complex system through which living phenomena change the earth. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you
very, very much. It's interesting how many parallels I started drawing by the end of the presentation, as this being like a template for explaining, our collective, reasons or potential, and I started drawing parallels to Carl Jung's like cognitive conscious. So like that's a question. When you have the slide about cognition, in that map, is that it was so long. I can't.
Where was that one?
All the I wish I could go back through all of the slides, but it's not looking yet. Anyway, it was just about the cognition and the flow map. And it was like very much at the beginning.
No, at the beginning.
Yeah. And it's that was,
oh, that one, yeah.
The yellow one.
Right, the drawing, yeah.
Yeah, that's opera. Is this kind of like another template or predisposing the same sort of concept of like a sort of collective unconsciousness in a way that like our
Absolutely, because what's not being shown here, you can see these little arrows around this outside, these little arrows. Well, what that means is that it's a flow, and each generation, each epoch, each generation constitutes a new drawing. So you could think of this as 1,000 layers, and together, if you made a drawing of this and you put 1,000 of these together, maybe Felix Gonzalez Torres poster work. It's a series of posters, and now what emerges is this collective unconscious.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I've been kind of diving in a little bit too.
That's why I showed this.
Psychology.
Sorry?
Alchemical psychology and how Jung's alchemy, and he wasn't so much interested in the mystical or transitive, material. He was more kind of equating to our collective unconsciousness, and most of this essentially were habits or self-behavior, learned behavior that are, in all of us and throughout history, is similar to the cat slide, that just goes
Exactly, because the cat, was very interesting, because the cat slide, which really, I didn't want to go too, I was trying to get through all the slides, and also, I want it to be interesting, and sometimes, I'm interested in certain things, but not everybody is,
Oh, that's great.
So I want to show you, because that's interesting that you mentioned that cat slide, right? Because, and this is key, what happens is, what this over here is, this amalgamum that happens in the 17-day-old cat, that visual cortex is what's called by there's a famous neuroscientist called Gerald Edelman, and he calls it the primary repertoire, because he was actually a musician. And he called the repertoire from his a musical repertoire from the repertoire. Yeah. And this is the secondary repertoire. But I'm also calling it from the Italian political theorist Agamben. I'm also calling this the neural zoe and the neural bias. The neural zoe is the neural bias, the primary repertoire is secondary repertoire. But this primary repertoire is a result of the whole history of the cat species, all the way back in deep time, all the way back in deep time. Yeah. It's also related to the experiences of the fetus in the mother's womb. If the mother was starved, if the mother had a flu or had a measles. And finally, it's related to the combination of mother and father's gametes. So there are three causes of this primary repertoire or neural zoe. And then what happens is also these umwelts, although they aren't as they're more crystallized and change less than human umwelts. Over the history of cats, the whole cat species, the umwelten have also changed with the different species, the different evolution of the species. So that's what a mirroring is. This is a kind of technology. The umwelt itself is a technology. It's a very crude and primitive form of technology. It's not technology like human beings create, but it's a technology. And it changes, it enforces itself on the neural plasticity, creating changes and organizing the neural elements. And the one thing I didn't mention also, since we're bringing it up again, is that once this umwelten has caused the change, again, this is the visual cortex, we're just talking about visuality here, which is very important for painting and sculpture. You know, there's an element of visuality in that also, is that some emergence takes place. So after these initial changes from the environment onto what's called the neural material neuropile, neuropile. This is the material of the brain. Another set of changes take place. Those that are constituting, those that are engaged, those that are not pruned away, but continue to become fortified and to exist, they start interacting with each other. So that brain is different than the genetic history of the animal and its ecological relationships. Right? Because that's what I was also talking about. Ecology. You can't just look at it, you have to think of it as an ecological system that it's embedded in.
Right. So this is the series that leads into my final question. I don't need to hog the room, but
yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, you studied medicine worse.
I studied neuroscience. I studied art. I studied photography and video. And then I had this crazy idea to go to Caltech and study neuroscience because I thought Andre Breton, and this is true, I really thought this kind of stuff when I was, 18, 17, 19, whatever.
So you're really familiar with the immune system.
The what?
The immune system.
Yeah, I am.
So I'm just thinking about the immune system.
Yeah.
As a parallel template or example of, like, if you think about like our type of like the countries as the innate immune system, then plasticity being sort of like adaptive immune system. So like, is it possible to?
There's Gerald Edelman, who I mentioned here, who had this idea of the primary repertoire and secondary repertoire. He was actually a friend of mine. I'd like to say that because we were friends. He was in San Diego and I was in California and Los Angeles at this time. He won two Nobel Prizes, one for neuroscience and one for immunology.
Right.
There you go. Okay.
Right.
And the memory systems is what he studied. And memory between B and T lymphocytes, they're very, very different. And memory in, between neurons and all this long-term and short-term memory and all those things, there's parallels. How do you guys, is this inspirational for making a work of art? Or does anybody feel that this could, that maybe somehow in the deep recesses of your mind, that some of this information could be exciting for you in terms of how you make work and what you think about when you make work? Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic to hear that. Yes, sir.
I don't know if necessarily inspirational, but just, I mean, just to critique, even just, on the presentation, like, no offense, just wildly confused. I think it's just incredibly complex. And I think there's just so much room for it to be simplified and like narrowed down in the conceptualized. And obviously it's, I mean, there's so much research that goes into this with.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thought. It's just, I think if it is such a great point to be made, like there's a lot where you can reach a lot more people. Just in a different way of presenting it.
Yeah, I know. I try. I really been working hard to do that.
Yeah,
I know.
Slides were fresh because it was the work, the finished process,
Yeah.
the artwork itself, and I felt that was like actually very well explained. I thought some stuff beforehand was.
But maybe if you had seen that work, okay, I agree. Okay, I agree, especially maybe for this setting. I agree. But how about if I said to you that the reason that you enjoy the artwork is because we had gone through all of that before?
I didn't understand. Yeah.
You didn't understand it? All right, I'm sorry to hear that.
There's a, I was
Yeah.
thinking similar thing, in full disclosure, I am probably the least intelligent person who's probably. Okay, so we did a pedestrian quality might have happened on that. Also, the full disclosure is Southern law of very prestigious ophthalmologist, World down on San Development.
Pardon me?
And I'm sorry?
You're the son of a world-renowned ophthalmologist?
Son-in-law.
Who's it?
My mother, San Development. So, but.
Okay, whatever.
So, the reason why I bring it up is because in the previous life of design and kind of communicate and to pitch a lot, I would ask for, are there physiological elements to comprehension and how can I get my work to communicate more? And I think what Simon was trying to maybe a little bit more dramatically suggest was that, or let me pose it as a question. Physiologically, does it help comprehension to like switch font sizes and density and have lots of words or light lettering on white backgrounds? I mean, maybe it's something that I was overlooking, but I was wondering at the beginning, really, if it actually was a choice. I thought you were building up to this is how your eye works, and that's kind of
No, I'm not. I was I don't know. I had those different colors for the titles because I thought I would go through each one of these sections. No, you're right. It's my work is it's I can reach everyone. I try, I really do. I spend a lot of time on this lecture to try to really find ways of communicating. And I thought that, I don't know, I would say that you probably understood more than you wanted. Okay, let's go one thing. Did you understand that there's that the brain is not just in the head? Yes or no? You said you guys didn't understand. Did you understand that the brain is not just intracranial, but is situated in a body that moves and that it's extracranial? It's manifested in social, political, economic, and historical conditions that you didn't understand that. That you did not understand.
From Sam Harris every morning on meditation.
Okay, good, right. On the meditation app, that's probably good.
I don't understand what you guys are. Hold on, this is awkward. We're not this, and we're not even a break. I'm saying it's information. I'm gonna redirect to the next questions. So we get more people participating. I am noticing
demographic pattern in who's engaging in this conversation so far. So I'd like to invite other voices. Yes, Edie, like you're gonna present.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny, I mean, I don't drive your company. It's kind of related, but it's not being as a perfect. About using the mind mapping with the also, because everything that makes sense, being kind of intelligent of the brains. And it made a lot of our songs. What
Would you want to take your mouth off this one a little bit? I know, I'm good.
Experience here, this is a black the individuals and conversations Steve, what about those using mind mapping as an visual?
Yeah, because I agree. I mean,
I was fond, but I think that's too.
I mean, we are on the verge of, I'm not, this wasn't part of my lecture, but I have like about 7 of these lectures, by the way, as confusing, all of this is confusing at this point. But we are entering actually in late cognitive capitalism, right? With mind in the brain of the new factory in the 21st century. You understood that, right? That there's a difference between working in a factory making cars and working in front of a screen. Yes or no? Come on. Come on, you're mental laborers.
Yes.
You understand about data, right? That they're collecting data, right? You know that. The big industry, big data. You ever heard of that, right?
After say that. Yeah. Say that.
Beautiful. So that's a mental labor. We're all, and you know what's the difference? The difference between the proletariat, which is just the name for the physical labor in a factory, they were a group of people that were doing that. But we're all cognitarians. We're all cognitive laborers. We're all creating data. Everybody who has a phone here is a cognitarian. That's the whole point, right? And when I was talking, so you understood that, right? Okay, good. And that was the other super important thing that I was talking about. The other thing is that we're moving even into another stage, right? Which is called neural capitalism. Okay? And neural capitalism is this commodification and normalization of the neuroplasticity. Did you understand anything about the neuroplasticity? That the brain can change, right? So you learned 3 things already. I'm telling you, you learned a lot more than you think. Okay? So you learned about neuroplasticity. When I was at this very school teaching in Charles Cross, masters in photo and whatever. 25 years ago, in 1996, I was teaching his class, and I started this thing called neuroaesthetics. I invented this term, and I invented this form of artwork, which is artists using the materials, practices, histories of artistic practice to investigate the same fields of information that neuroscience do, but to come up with very different paradigms, right? I started that here 25 years ago in Charles Cross class. I gave 3 lectures. Not one person in the audience knew what neuroplasticity means. Not one. Never heard of neuroplasticity. 25 years ago. You can go to my artbrain.org. It's a website that I started 25 years ago. You can go and see what kind of works. They're there, there's people like Oliver Eliasson, there are people like Anushka Karan, there's people like so many people that you've heard of, John Kessler, I mean, you name it, they're on there, they're all working that way, okay? That was 25 years ago. So things have changed, radically changed, and you now know what neuroplasticity is. The other thing is that we're moving from the information, sorry about it, to the, you asked the question about the mind and the brain. This is what I'm coming to now. Okay, we are entering into neurocapitalism. Who's heard of Neuralink? Who knows what Neuralink is? The new brain-computer interfaces that are connected to the internet, right? That's called Neuralink. Neuralink is only one example of what are called technoseuticals. So you know what a pharmaceutical is, right? Who knows what a pharmaceutical is? Raise your hand.
The drug that affects the drug.
It's a drug, pharmaceutical.
Science in the industry of medication.
It's medication. Well, then now there's a whole realm of things called technoseuticals, which are instruments, physical instruments that are implanted in the brain. For instance, brain-computer interfaces, right? There's also cortical implants. There's something called optogenetics, where they can make an algae, a fluorescent algae. They can extract they can extract that protein and through a virus inject this fluorescent protein into a nerve cell and make it illuminate when a certain kind of laser is shined on it, and they can turn memory off and on. That's very serious. Okay, that's very serious. That's neurocapitalism. Okay, so when you ask me about the mind or the brain, we are no longer in the mind is something from the 19th century. We could talk about Kant and Hegel, we could talk about transcendental idealism and materialism, okay, if we wanted to. Those discussions are over. We need to know this stuff about the brain, about the material brain, because the kinds of situations that you're going to be connected to, the kinds of things you need to make decisions on, for your kids, if you have kids, or for yourself. Certain kinds of new technologies are coming along that are so dangerous and despotic. And if you know nothing about neuroscience, if you know nothing about the brain, you cannot make an intelligent decision. And you will be, unfortunately, anyway, that's part of my consciousness raising also. But let's talk about an example of neurocapitalism. I was going to give this in the beginning. Let's talk about it. I noticed that a lot of you guys are only using your iPhone, your GPS to go wayfind. Okay, most of you, when you're going to visit somebody, you're driving around, you're going on a road trip, or even if you're going down to Soho, you've been there 1,000 times. You use your iPhone and use GPS. Is that correct? Who uses their GPS a lot? Like Google Maps? Yeah, Google Maps, exactly. Right. Who's doing that, right? Okay, right? Okay. Now, Mark and I, we grew up at a time when there was no GPS, right? Okay. Now, let's take these two situations. One, I don't have to get everywhere without GPS. I don't even use it that much, to be honest with you. Even if I go to LA when I was living, I don't even use the GPS. I can go to different cities and I never use it. But I use it sometimes, but I don't use it as much as you think. Now, because I wayfind and learned how to wayfind on my own without a technological exteriorization project, this is just conceivable now. My brain, my wayfinding mode remained, and I built up neural pathways between my hippocampus and my parietal lobe. You don't need to know that. I know you don't want to know those terms. Hippocampus, that's where we remember things, and parietal lobe is where we learn how to map. I made connections because I grew up wayfinding
Without Google Maps.
Without Google Maps and without any of this. So I don't need it. But you guys need it, and you haven't developed those connections. Now, what happens when all of a sudden, have you noticed that when somebody on Facebook says, oh, you've got to read this article in the New York Times, and you say, okay, I want to look, it looks interesting, I'll go there. All of a sudden, a pop-up comes up when you're on Guardian and it says, you've read it 5 times. I'm sorry, you have to pay for it. You have to pay for it if you want to read the New York Times again, or if you want to read the Guardian, right? How many have you experienced this? Okay. So now we have a situation where there are these firewalls, and all of a sudden, capitalism, sorry I'm using that word, but why don't I use another word? I'm just saying, all of a sudden, I'm paying for something that was free before. But how about with GPS? What happens 5 years from now when you're trying to go now somewhere and you want to use your GPS and it pops up and says, I'm sorry, you use this GPS 25 times. For now, you have to pay. You are paying for something your brain already would have done had you learned how to wayfind. That's neural capitalism. And it's real. It's real. Now, did you understand that? Now, I would argue that because of my lecture, your level of knowledge and understanding of all these things has been greatly improved. Even though I understand it, but when I talk, sometimes it's even impossible for me to understand. I read papers that I wrote 5 years ago. What the hell is that? So I understand what you're saying. It's very complicated, and I have this book that I'm right now, I'm happy to send you the PDF of it for free. I don't want to make any money. This book can change your life. And I'm not kidding, it will.
Can you read us the title on the mic?
It's called The Glossary of Cognitive Activism for a Not Too Distant Future. There are 300 terms in here. They're all only 300, maybe 3 pages. The longest one is about 3 pages long, and mostly 2 pages. You can read it on the train, on the toilet, before you go to bed, everything. This is all the terms you need to understand why Donald Trump is winning. All of that information is about neurocapitalism. They all know about it. They all know about it. They know about disattention. They know about the attention economy and disattention. They know about it. They know how to create dissonance. And I don't even, maybe I shouldn't even be talking about Trump. There may be some people here who are for it, and that's fine. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about these guys know everything. And it's time for you guys. And I would send the PDF to Mark and anybody who wants it, please, for free. I sold these at the printing matter book fair. I sold, well, 2 years ago, this is the 3rd edition. The 2nd edition, I sold 234 of these in 3 days last year. This year, we ran out. So,
Warren,
what?
I just, we do have a few more minutes for questions, but you've got a provocative critique from several people, and that seems to have derailed the opportunity for other people to engage. I understand that you're trying to now defend your but I would really like, if it's okay, to move on to
All right, you saw
a questioning, a level of engagement that I think other people may be interested in.
Sure.
What's wrong to do is just that, we got our game.
No, I'm glad you did, because, it's really important for me to communicate. Yeah, sorry, go. Yeah, sorry, let's go. I can stay here longer. I don't believe it.
They're burning off.
Okay, and you guys, okay, fine. Yes, so who wants to go first?
Everything's like moving away from this meeting. Kind of
Yeah.
One is just out of curiosity, are there any like opposing frameworks to like the framework that you're creating or
Yes, yes,
okay,
yeah.
and then also like and just like maybe a little bit of this, and then also my other question is like, are there like are there artists that are like referencing this framework or frameworks in the way that they like interpret their practice and like maybe something to
Yeah. There is, there's another on academia.edu. Who's on academia.edu? Who uses academia.edu? Fantastic resource, it's free. Believe me, you should all be on it and you should be all reading on it. It's incredible. It's an incredible resource. On academia.edu, to answer your question, I have in that book, Mark, where's the other book, the red one? I have the introduction, volume 3 or volume 1? This one. This one. And this is another book I just published. It's called An Activist Neuroaesthetic Reader. There's a different position called positivism. Okay, and there's a different neuroaesthetics, which is called positivist neuroaesthetic. This introductory chapter is online at academy.edu. You can find it, and there it shows lays out the 2 positions. Okay, of this relation between positivism and activism, and the artists that are participating in each one and all that. And I did a show, which is also online, and it's on this new website called Activist Neuroaesthetics that I have, and there's an exhibition I curated in Berlin with there were 35 artists in that exhibition, and there also you can find what you're looking for. Everything's online, they're all free. If you're interested, you can do it, Yeah. So introduction to this book is really important for anybody who's interested in it. Really? Oh, okay, yes.
So I guess I was thinking about you talking about like any kind of domination. We're talking about the new type of labor that is
We need alienation from markets, alienation to like, what would this kind of alienation, how would we term that? What would be the way for us to deal with this kind of alienation? As cognitive in this world, computer.
Yeah, well, if you read, I think the Franco Berardi is somebody you want to read. There's a great book called The Soul at Work. And it's a fantastic book, MIT Press. And he's talking about the thickness of the infosphere. He calls it the thickness. There's two different things that they're talking about now. He calls it the thickness of the infosphere. That our brain's neuroplasticity is not up to the task. See, there's a lot of people writing about this, like myself. There's so many people who are interested in this, it's beyond what. Anyway, and he said that our brain's neuroplasticity is not capable of dealing with the acceleration. This word is acceleration. The acceleration of new technology. So every day we have a new technique, a new technology, a new this, a new that, and it's beyond a certain kind of capacity. And that causes a kind of depression and a lot of anxiety. So it's part of cognitive capitalism. It's part of the discourse of cognitive capitalism. And in this book I have, there's acceleration that is really well defined. I spent 5 years every day for 5 hours every morning, waking up at 5 in the morning. I'm telling you the truth. I mean, I know many young people think that the only way that people become well known is because they know people and all of it. It's not good. It's hard to work on that. So for 5 years, every day for 5 hours a day, I'm not your father saying that I walked to school through the snow, but I'm telling you the truth. It took me 5 years to write this for 5 hours every day. And I spent a lot of time trying to make it so easy to understand. But again, it's still difficult, I know. But I try so hard to make it really easy. And you can make it pretty remarkable.
So Yuli's question was about the alienation of labor. It's this Marxist concept, which stems from the fact that in capitalist economies, workers don't own the factory. Whereas in pre-industrial, pre-capitalist economic situations, an artisan might well own their workshop. They get to decide what to make and how to make it. And so by owning and controlling your work, you're not alienated from it or estranged from it. So the question is, how does alienation function in knowledge economies or under cognitive capitalism? And I think I have an example of it. I just wanted to check it with you.
Okay.
So, Google Maps gets to know us because it's driven by machine learning systems that compare our choices against the choices and decisions of lots of other people. And it starts to show things on the map to you that it won't necessarily show to me based on, for example, your browsing history and your purchasing history and stuff like that. So we don't control the ways in which these systems, you call them agents at one point, software system, manipulate or create choices for us. You can't go into Instagram and change what the algorithm is doing. We're doing labor for free, right? Every time we post to Instagram, we scroll and use Google Maps. We're basically providing information about ourselves so we can better model our behavior, manipulate it, and get us to be more productive consumers and producers of more data. So we're alienating that labor because we don't know what we don't control.
Is that right? A lot of, that was great information. The only thing I would add, of course, is that what happens on the assembly line is that the labor becomes so abstract that you're not making the whole object. You're making a little section. You hit a hammer, you hit a nail, you hit a bolt, you screw a bolt. I mean, everybody's is being, the labor becomes so abstract on the assembly line that there is this alienation of the project, problem of alienation. The alienation of how many people are having trouble with memory here? Right? How many, okay, any more having problems with memory? Yeah. It's called the Google effect. It's an actual effect. And what it is the fact of the matter is that you are allowing for Google to remember things for you. And you are, instead of memorizing things for yourself, you know that Google will know everything for you. And it's called the Google effect. And it's affecting a lot of people. This is another example of neurocapitalism, where your memories are being affected. He was talking about Google bubbles. These are these kinds of things that are causing alienation because the feed that you're getting and I'm getting are completely different. Even if you look up shoes, what you're getting and I'm getting. And what was happening was that people from the right wing were getting information because they kept on looking at right-wing causes and right-wing information and their interest was there. They kept on getting fed back right-wing types of stuff, and left-wing people were doing the same. And then it caused this complete schism between left and right. I mean, these are real things, you know. It's not only, this is another thing you might not thought about. It's not only what you're searching for, but each of us has a specific methodology of search. We each search in a different way, and that also identifies us. So it's not just that you're searching today for jewelry and you're searching here, or I'm looking for a vacation and I look, you know, in a certain way. I look for certain kinds of information. I'm looking as I have a pattern, a cognitive pattern. Now there's an amazing philosopher, Korean philosopher who lives in Germany. His name is Byung Chung, and he has this idea, not neural power, but he has psychopower. And he says that people are giving up their right to privacy to use the internet. And that in the old days, despotism or governance was something that came from top down and was something that was instituted by those in control to police or to regulate their constituencies, right? You know about that, right? Now people are giving up those rights happily and freely to be able to be on the internet. These are real things. These are the things that are happening.
We have a little economy, it's not everywhere, like not so much in China, but we have one more question from somebody else. Okay.
Yeah, you can all come to me later and talk to me. You can talk later. But come after. Just I cannot go with this. You had a question, right?
Yeah. Okay, so you asked us if this presentation was inspiring, like earlier on in the discussion. And like, I'm still trying to figure out whether or not, like, personally, I find it positive or like pessimistic, you know, like I believe in deep ecology, but I sometimes feel like that's like loosely connected to misanthropic sort of, you know, ways of thinking. But anyway, what I want to talk about, I guess, is you said that the same technologies that have shaped the human brain have also caused the destruction of the planet in so many ways.
Yeah, that's right.
And so my question, I guess, is do you think that technology is not only destroying the planet, but we're in essence destroying ourselves because our brain is basically 10,000 years old. We're caveman brain, we're operating on this level of stress and existential crisis, and it's creating memory problems, like you mentioned, and ADHD, and you know, mental health issues, and like there's four-year-olds on the internet. It's ridiculous. Like that's insane. And 24/7
Phones.
Yeah, phones and iPads, whatever stupid shit parents give them, but like 24/7 work is also extremely unhealthy, and like I don't know, it's just, I don't think that we were ever meant to live this way. So do you believe that maybe we're heading towards a crash and like technology is going to become cognizant or constant, surpass us and destroy us?
Well, you know, I've done a lot. I've also made artworks about exactly what you're talking about is a singularity when machine intelligence overtakes human intelligence. At that point, when that happens, it's called the singularity. So I made a piece called it's called a proposition for an alternative Parthenon marbles, The Phantom is Other, in which I created a large wall sculpture in which I was talking about how instead of the Parthenon marbles creating the patterns that sculpted the deep learning neural network, the phantom limbs growing off the broken arms and legs to create an alternative, a different kind of alternative, de-optimized deep learning network. That's where, and I think there's a lot of people who are thinking this way. A lot of people thinking this way, de-optimizing deep learning neural networks.
Yeah, I can see the positivity in like the Cthulhu scene, if I'm thinking that right, and Donna Haraway. Like we're learning a little, a few of us are learning a little bit about them already, like the active scene,
Yeah.
in our art and climate class. So this is in some ways familiar, some of us. So I thought it was just kind of cool that we had them come in and talk about all of this.
Well, you know, it's honestly, the way I've been teaching this stuff really is I've been teaching it like through 12 different hour-long sessions where I begin with the most rudimentary stuff and then I build up to it, like I teach at the Weisen Sie Kunsthalle or in the part in the Sorbonne, Harry Wheat. I mean, I have a whole, it's not just one class, and yeah, I don't know, but the thing is it's a little pessimistic. I am pessimistic, to be honest with you. And I think that like I just was interviewed for this Log magazine. It's an architectural magazine that comes out from Columbia. No, okay, it was a really cool magazine called Log. I suggest everyone look at it. It's fantastic. It's Cynthia Davidson. Do you know Cynthia? Okay, so they just interviewed me about all of this stuff that I just talked to you about today. And all the exact same stuff. But what I was talking about is how come people are not, how come they're climate deniers? Why is that happening? Why are people, Don't Look Up, that movie that was in a way, I thought it was a fabulous movie. Other people hated it. I thought it was great. But anyway, whatever. I think it was like very to the point in a way. But anyway, so I developed this word called eco-agnosia, the inability to recognize climate disaster. I think that's where we are right now. I think we're in this, prosopagnosia was it was by Oliver Sacks. Probably never anybody ever heard of Oliver Sacks, right? He wrote, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. So this person had this disorder of inability to recognize faces called prosopagnosia. And so agnosia, so I call this thing called eco-agnosia. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. And,
Warren, I was just gonna jump
Yeah.
in since we're
Yeah.
kind of on
Oh, we're
2 hours.
late. Yeah.
I think we should start to wrap up.
Okay.
But I want to thank you so much
Yes, thank you.
for
Before I let you go, I don't think Simon, you owe any apologies. I think it was great that you spoke up and probably weren't the only one feeling like what you were articulating. These are challenging ideas. I was a little concerned when I invited you because this program shelters you guys a little bit from high-level discourse. We have filled our seminars out year after year to make them more accessible. And I thought, it's okay to occasionally throw in something that is pitched to a different level of intellectual sophistication. Do you want to say something?
I want to say that I really appreciated, for this course, and having that level of sophistication. I have only heard for time, but I really missed that. I just wanted to say thank you, and nothing good comes easy.
Well, yeah, but I kind of think it was fruitful in a way to confront that because it brings up a big issue, which is accessibility, The fact that this is a really diverse community of students, some of you have, you know, a lot of background in theory, philosophy, cultural criticism, et cetera, some of them not so much. And so I feel really comfortable with the way this Q&A went, and I'm glad that it took the direction it took, actually. I tried to, you know, steer it back in a way.
Yeah,
So,
no, but
you know,
I really enjoyed the question, and it's something that I'm not defending myself. I'm not a defensive person because I'm doing what I'm doing. No, I'm not defending. But I do think it's not defensive to feel that you have to answer a question.
standing up here. We should let these guys go. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.